Beneath these mountains sits stone that was a seafloor before anything walked on land. Whole towns drowned on purpose, with their roads still running into the water. And a buried world so old, it makes the pyramids look like last week's news. Most people think Appalachia is blue ridgelines, fall color, and a cabin overlook. That's the lid, not the box. By the time we reach number 1, you'll be standing over the oldest thing in Eastern America. And it's still down there right now. Number 18, the blue that isn't smoke. Start with the thing this whole range is named for, because we still can't fully predict it. The Cherokee called these mountains Shakanage, place of blue smoke, long before a tourism board printed it on a mug. Picture standing at an overlook at dawn, watching that blue haze pool in the valleys like water. It isn't smoke, and it isn't ordinary fog. Most of it is the forest breathing. The trees pump out huge volumes of organic compounds that react in sunlight, form tiny particles, and scatter the light toward blue. That's the broad outline. The fine detail stays open. Exactly how heat, humidity, and plant chemistry combine to make one specific shade over one specific ridge on one specific afternoon is something scientists still model rather than close. And modern pollution drifting entangles the natural signal further. Think about that. The single most photographed thing in America's busiest national park is a haze we've named, branded, and sold, and still can't fully explain from one afternoon to the next. Number 17, the river that broke the rules. Here's a river that ignored the mountains completely. Most rivers go around a range. The New River goes straight through one, cutting a gorge over 1,000 feet deep across the grain of the Appalachians like the mountains weren't there. Stand on the overlook by the big steel bridge, and you're looking at Whitewater and the country's newest national park. Look again. This is one of the oldest rivers on Earth, old enough that geologists argue in tens of millions of years instead of agreeing on a number. Its trick has a name: antecedent drainage. The river was already here, flowing on its course, when the land started rising underneath it. So it just cut down as fast as the rock came up and held its line while a whole mountain range grew around it. The state sells the gorge as new. The bridge, the park, the base jumpers. The only new thing in the frame is the name on the sign. Everything the water touches is ancient, and the river was here first. Number 16, a page no one can read. Just off the park's southern edge sits a slab of stone covered in writing nobody alive can read. This is Cherokee homeland, and here lies Judaculla Rock, its surface carrying hundreds of separate carvings, swirls, lines, and figures pecked into the soapstone across a span nobody can precisely date. The old stories tie it to Tzul'kalu', a giant said to have left his mark crossing the land. Kneel down beside it and run your eyes across the surface. It's one of the most densely carved petroglyph stones in the eastern United States, and most people drive right past the turnoff. Here's the part that stays with you. Nobody has produced a confident reading of what it means. Archaeologists have mapped it for years, but the meaning was never written down anywhere except the stone itself, and the people who carved it left no key. So you stand over a slab knowing every mark was a deliberate choice, knowing it meant something exact to someone, and knowing the answer went into the ground with the hands that made it. A full page of careful writing in a language with no alphabet left to crack. Number 15, the town they couldn't bury. There's a ghost town in the middle of this wilderness the park spent a century unable to make up its mind about. After loggers stripped the valley around Elkmont and moved on, the wealthy of Knoxville turned it into a summer retreat. A club, a grand hotel, rows of cottages along the river. When the park absorbed the land, families hung on through lifetime leases that dragged out for decades. So the buildings kept aging in place while the Park Service argued with itself. Preserve them? Bulldoze them? And let the forest take it back? In the end, both happened, and the logic behind which cottage got saved and which got flattened was never especially clean. Walk it today, and you pass standing chimneys, sagging porches, and doorways opening onto rhododendron. Here's the strange overlap. The famous synchronous fireflies blink through these same ruins every June, which means the crowds come for the insects and walk straight past the town without a glance. A settlement that survived not by any decision, but by decades of nobody able to make one. The overlooks and the ghost towns, those you can almost explain away. Almost. But now the mountains start hiding things underground, and the deeper we go, the less certain anyone gets. Let me say one thing here, and then leave it alone. Everything we're walking through, the drowned towns, the unreadable stone, the world buried under all of it, I've gathered into a book. It's called the Appalachian Mysteries Collection, and it's the long version of what won't fit in one video. The sources, the arguments still running, and the places you can go, stand in yourself. If you want it, it's there waiting. That's all I'll say about it. Now, back down the mountain. Number 14, rivers that vanish. There's a valley here where the rivers drop into the ground and don't fully explain themselves coming back out. Cades Cove is the most visited spot in the whole park, an 11-mile loop of open pasture ringed by peaks, and almost nobody driving it knows they're sitting on the strangest geology in the range. The mountains around the cove are ancient, hard, weather-resistant rock. The floor of the cove is limestone, soft, riddled with the cracks and voids water loves. Think about how backwards that is. A window of soluble rock sitting in the middle of a range built from the opposite. And limestone does what limestone does. Streams disappear into sinkholes, run through cave passages beneath the pasture, and resurface somewhere else entirely. And the full plumbing of where the water goes has never been completely mapped. Cavers have traced parts of it. Parts of it stay dark, so the prettiest loop in the Smokies, the one with the deer and the cabins and the traffic jams, is floating on a hidden system of water that keeps most of its route to itself. Number 13, the loop built on loss. That same peaceful loop is also a record of who was forced out to make it. Cades Cove looks like a preserved slice of frontier Appalachia, split rail fences, log churches, cabins, a working mill. What the postcards leave out is that this was a living community. Hundreds of people, farms worked for well over a century until the land was taken to assemble the park in the early 20th century. The buildings were preserved. The people were not allowed to stay. Some fought it. Some took lifetime leases and watched the place turn into a tourist drive around them. Their churches still hold cemeteries of families who were moved off the very ground their relatives are buried in. Watch the visitors photographing those cabins as scenery, mostly, not registering that they're photographing an eviction. This is the emotional core of the park, the part the brochure carefully doesn't dwell on. The prettiest loop in the Smokies is also its longest memory of who had to leave so the rest of us could pull over and take the picture. Number 12, the cold that shouldn't exist. Some places in these mountains stay near freezing in the dead heat of August, and nobody can fully say why one holds its cold and the next doesn't. Across the range, there are jumbles of collapsed boulders, ice caves, and blowing fissures where cold air pours up out of the rock, and pockets of the maze keep that chill deep into summer. Imagine standing there sweating and feeling it roll over you from inside the mountain. The broad idea is that cold, dense air settles into the lower voids in winter and drains out slowly through the warm months. But that doesn't close the case, because the behavior varies wildly from one formation to the next, some holding ice into July while a nearly identical pile a ridge over holds none at all. And pinning down exactly what decides it is still messy work. Then there's the human strangeness on top. People found these spots long before refrigeration, a reliably cold place in the dead heat of a southern summer, tucked inside a mountain, with no fire and no explanation they could have had. Nature built a cold room in the rock, dropped the key, and walked off. Number 11. The towns drowned on purpose. Across this region, entire valley communities were deliberately flooded to build reservoirs for power, flood control, and water supply. Whole towns were bought out, sometimes condemned outright, then put underwater as the lakes rose behind new dams. Picture a lake surface, flat and calm on a summer morning. Now picture an old road running down the bank and continuing straight into the water without stopping. In drought years, when the reservoirs drop, foundations and roadbeds reappear along the shoreline, and people who still remember the towns come back to walk them. The benefits were real. The power and flood protection changed the region. The thing buried under the water is displacement. Families paid, relocated, and told the flooding served a greater good they didn't get to vote on. The lake in the brochure is scenic and calm. Under it, on purpose, is a town that used to be somebody's home. We're past the easy half of the map now. Blue haze, ghost towns, vanishing rivers, drowned ones. But everything so far still has a shape you can picture. What's coming lives under the leaf litter and past the last road. And the closer we get, the older it gets. Number 10, the nation that stayed. Start with what the tourist road gets wrong by leaving it out. In 1838, the federal government forced most Cherokee people west along the Trail of Tears, a removal that killed thousands. The version most outsiders carry ends right there, an emptied homeland, a march into memory. It's incomplete. A group of Cherokee stayed in these mountains, some by hiding in the high country, some through legal maneuvering and the help of men who held land on their behalf when the law wouldn't let them hold it themselves. Their descendants are the Eastern Band of Cherokee, and today they govern the Qualla boundary, right at the edge of the park. Picture a working government, a language being taught to a new generation of kids, a community running its own institutions, not a memorial, a nation. Millions drive through on their way to the park and register it as a gift shop stop instead of a survival. The removal gets taught as an ending. A few ridges over, the people it was built to erase never left. The postcard frames these mountains as empty wilderness. That emptiness was manufactured and it was resisted. Number 9, the salamander capital of Earth. The strangest population in this park is hiding right under your boots. These mountains hold one of the densest concentrations of salamander species on Earth, around 30 of them packed into the ridges and streams. So many that biologists call this range the salamander capital of the world. Most belong to a family that does something almost unbelievable. They have no lungs at all. They breathe entirely through their skin, which is why they need this cool, permanently damp forest and can't live just anywhere. Some species exist on a single mountain and nowhere else on the planet, having split off in isolation on one slope. What researchers are still working out is exactly how so many close relatives divided and stayed separate across such a compact patch of ground. Picture walking a rainy trail and seeing nothing at all. Under your boots, in the wet leaves and the stream beds, is a rainforest packed into one mountain range, and new species still turning up on single slopes nobody thought to check twice. Number 8. The forest the saws missed. Almost the entire park was clear-cut, which makes what survived hard to believe. In the early 20th century, logging companies stripped these mountains at industrial scale, with whole watersheds shaved down and railroads run up the hollows to haul the timber out. And yet, in a handful of coves too steep or too far up to reach for a profit, the original forest was simply never taken. Albright Grove is one of the finest surviving pieces. Walk in and the scale rearranges your sense of the East entirely, with tulip poplars past 20 feet around, hemlocks and silverbells towering into a canopy that has never been cut, and a floor of fallen giants slowly going back to soil. This is one of the largest tracts of old growth left in the eastern United States, a genuine piece of what the whole region looked like before the saws. and exactly why these specific pockets slipped through when the machinery came for everything else isn't cleanly documented. Access, terrain, timing, luck, all tangled together. A near primeval forest with no business still standing this far east, a few miles off a road most people drive right past. That's the living world down here. Now the floor drops out from under the timeline, because the next things aren't old in centuries. They're old in a way the human mind can't hold. And number 1 is the oldest of all. Number 7, coffins carved from stone. In the river valleys that flank these mountains, an entire people buried their dead in coffins made of rock. Across the southern Appalachian River country, the Mississippian people built what archaeologists call stone box graves, lining the sides and floor with flat limestone slabs and sealing the body under a stone lid. Picture a fitted container of solid rock, built for a single human being. Huge numbers have been documented. Whole cemeteries of slab boxes clustered on the flat ground near the water. And here's the detail that lands. The boxes hold adults and infants alike. And the smallest graves, built for children, were made with the same fitted stone and the same patience as the largest. This wasn't rushed or careless. It was a deep tradition, kept alive across many generations, in burial grounds far older than any county line now drawn over them. The high country gets all the attention. The valleys wrapping around it were sealing their dead in stone the whole time, and almost nobody who visits ever hears about it. Number 6, tools beside the mammoths. Now the timeline really opens up. At the northeastern end of this same mountain system, a place called Saltville holds an ancient salt marsh that trapped and preserved the deep past in its mud. What's come out of that mud stretches how long we know people have been in this range. Ice Age animal bones, mammoth and other vanished species. And alongside them, evidence some researchers read as stone tools and butchered bone, pointing to a human presence at the very end of the last ice age, with some findings argued to reach back many thousands of years. The dating at sites this old is genuinely debated, and the case isn't airtight. But sit with the possibility. People standing in these same mountains while mammoths still breathed and the glaciers were still grinding north, in a range you now cross in an afternoon on a paved road. Everything else on this list is recent by comparison. This is the deep end of the timeline, and the water down here is very dark. Number 5, the meadows that refuse trees. High on the crest sit open meadows that shouldn't be there at all. They're called grassy balds, wide, treeless domes sitting on peaks warm enough and wet enough that they should be thick forest. Instead, they're bare and grassy, and have apparently been that way for a very long time. Here's the problem. Staring back at you. These aren't above the tree line. Trees grow fine hundreds of feet higher on nearby slopes. So, why do the balds stay open? Researchers have proposed ice age grazing by vanished giants, later grazing by elk and livestock, ancient fire, native land management, climate quirks, and combinations of all of it. And after generations of study, there's still no settled answer. Left alone, many slowly grow over, which tells you something was keeping them clear that no longer is. The Park Service now mows some of them by hand just to stop the forest from erasing them, which is its own quiet admission. A meadow on a mountaintop that shouldn't exist, held open by a hand we can no longer name. Number 4, life with no name. When scientists set out to catalog every living thing inside this park, they expected to fill in a few gaps. What they got was the opposite. The project has turned up many hundreds of species entirely new to science, and many thousands more never before recorded here, and the count keeps climbing. Every time specialists look harder at the fungi, the insects, the microscopic life in the soil and streams, they find more that no one has ever described. Estimates of how much life actually lives inside the boundary run to tens of thousands beyond what's been named. Sit with what that means. This is not a remote jungle. It's a park with gift shops and a paved road over the crest, sitting on top of tens of thousands of living things we haven't named yet. A place we mapped down to the parking lot and never finished discovering. Two left? And here's where the title finally comes due, because everything so far, the oldest trees, the oldest bones, is young next to what these mountains are actually made of. The pyramids are about to look recent. Number 3, the fish that vanished. The strangest disappearances in these mountains didn't happen in the forest. They happened in the water. The southern Appalachian streams evolved fish, mussels, and snails found nowhere else, sealed off in single drainages for so long that each valley became its own private aquarium. The freshwater mussel diversity here was once among the richest on Earth. Here's the hard part. A number of these species have slipped toward extinction or vanished entirely inside the last century, some documented, some presumably gone before anyone ever described them. Imagine a biologist wading a creek where a species was recorded a few decades ago and simply not finding it, then not finding it the next year, or ever again. The mystery here isn't eerie, it's sharper than that. In one of the best studied wild regions in the country, life that took millions of years to become unique disappeared so quietly that in some cases we're not fully sure what we had before it went. The rivers kept their secrets and then took a few of them for good. Number 2, the storm trapped in stone. The rock under your feet holds a record almost too old to picture. These are among the oldest mountains on Earth, and the stone that makes them was laid down long before the range ever rose, in ancient seas and river systems hundreds of millions of years ago. Look closely at exposed rock in the right places, and you can read that vanished world directly. Ripple marks from a shoreline that dried up before complex life ever crawled onto land. Mud cracks, the frozen texture of a seafloor. Geologists use these surfaces to reconstruct environments that existed before there were trees, before there were bones, before almost anything you'd recognize as alive. Think about running your hand across a ripple set by a tide that went out 750 million years ago. You're standing on the pressed flat memory of a world that ended before the dinosaurs began. And it isn't even the oldest thing down here. Number 1, older than the pyramids by a mile. Here's the payoff. The whole climb was built for. In a few places in these mountains, you can walk up and put your hand flat on the oldest thing in Eastern America. It's called basement rock, the ancient core the entire range was stacked on top of. And in spots like the deep gorges and a handful of exposed cliff faces, it breaks the surface where you can actually touch it. Picture laying your palm against a gray, banded wall of stone on a quiet afternoon. That rock is over 1 billion years old. Not old like the cabins, not old like the graves, not even old like the mammoths. When the first stone of the first pyramid was cut, this wall had already been sitting here, ancient and buried for hundreds of millions of years. The pyramids aren't even close. That's the lost world under Appalachia. Not hidden in a cave, not sunk in a lake. Standing at the surface in plain sight, holding up every postcard view above it, and older than almost anything humans have ever built or ever will. Everything you drove here to see, the haze, the forests, the balds, the drowned towns, is just the thin new skin on top of it. The mountains are old. This is what they're standing on, and you can put your hand on it. So the Appalachia most people reduce to one fogged overlook is, underneath, one of the deepest and least finished places in the country. Drowned towns, unnamed life, unreadable stone, and a buried world older than almost anything humans have ever built. Tell me in the comments about the one near you, the drowned road that surfaces in a dry summer, the carved rock nobody can read, the cold spot in the woods that has no business being cold, because those are the ones we're hunting next. Subscribe so you're here when we go deeper. and the next investigation is already waiting for you right there on screen.